worked previously in a school in London, we made a big focus on developing students' mindsets. My classroom, like the majority of classrooms in our school, had displays with motivational quotes from all types of celebrities, scientists, sports people, etc. And trust me, nobody loves a good Michael Jordan quote more than myself. But there was times where I really wondered, how is this going to help our students with their problem-solving skills in maths when faced with a challenging question? Having recently become a father, I had read an article about the way we praise our children can have a profound impact on their mindset. Research on praise and mindsets shows that when we praise children for being smart, it promotes a fixed mindset. Now, there's also the negative side of that as well. I think I'll always use the example of my own experience back in primary school. I think I would have been the equivalent of a year 4. We all stood up. We were all singing the song Little Donkey, hoping to be part of the school choir. And I felt that dreaded tap on my shoulder, which basically meant sit down, it won't be you. And ever since then, I don't sing in public. In fact, I don't even sing in the shower. It's funny how these things will stick with us. But the contrast is praising kids for working hard can promote a growth mindset. And we have seen obviously huge benefits for the maths department with how we've obviously implemented this. This link led us to developing our learning journey in year 9, where we wanted students to be able to see visible learning and the importance of effort, because these meaningful learning tasks give students a clear sense of progress that they were able to see throughout the year. To look at it, first of all, I suppose, it's to show you the design. Now, it is quite a simple design, and it also shows it's kind of our starting point for how we were designing it, depending on the topic. It also will show how it will work with other subjects. And I see this in terms of myself. I'm learning Spanish currently with one-to-one lessons. And a big aspect of what I quite like about my lessons is I like to see where we are going. I even like to know, well, what are we doing next week? So it does allow me a time to even prepare for it, or I can see where all of this is leading. So the learning journey has a simple, obviously, start to it. We do look at obviously a topic, like in this case, coordinate geometry. And our starting point is, well, what is the basics we want students to know? So from a maths point of view, that is, can they identify and plot points in all 4 coordinates? And then where do we want them to finish up? Now that is obviously interpreting a straight line graph in this topic, having the understanding and knowledge of parallel and perpendicular lines. Now I'll show a full example of this later, where we actually fill in then the in-between, the journey as they go through this topic, and how it will increase in challenge as they move from left to right through this. This, as I said, has worked in other subjects, and it is a very simple thing that I've seen other subjects such as English do, where over a half term they've mapped out, well, what's our starting point? Where do we want to finish? Now, we get students to rag these. I'll show examples of this later, but students will look at these statements. They will color them in red, amber, or green, depending on how confident they feel. They will do this at the very start of a topic, so before any teaching time. Now, to stop certain students being a bit heavy-handed with the green color, we do link each statement with a corresponding task. And that is where we build up, obviously, our questions. So we can see there the first statement has quite a nice task for our students. So if they did color it in green, they're then being able to show, I can do this, because they're able to complete that question. And obviously, as they work through to the harder questions at the end, they're able to attempt that. Now, in the majority of cases, students won't be able to complete these at the end, because it might be that first time that they're looking at it from that GCSE standard of their starting point, which they have the skills built in from Key Stage 3, but where they are going to the end. Now, this is an important indicator of prior knowledge for the students, but also that's really important for the teacher, because that allows us to see really and inform our future planning. It's also low stake questions. There is no impact on their grade. The students complete this at the start under no pressure to be able to say, well, you have to do everything. The point here is give it a go. If you can do it, brilliant. If you can't, you're just not able to do it yet. Now, obviously, that is the first section that we obviously have. Well, the first 2 sections, the statements and the questions. We then looked at what the third aspect was. And I think obviously from our point of view in our school, we looked at the challenge for our students, and the main challenge for them can sometimes be processing how to start a question. So what is known as maths in the conditional knowledge, and that in terms of a GCSE question means they might be able to do the algebraic skill, but they mightn't be able to identify that that's what they have to do. It's that starting point. So the EEF have obviously done some amazing work on raising literacy levels in secondary school. So one of the areas we really wanted to focus on is the third aspect of this: how can we improve the disciplinary literacy? Now, the EEF have obviously promoted a report. This is about improving literacy in secondary schools, and it did form a big impact on that final section we give to our students. For anyone who's not familiar with the report, the summary really focused on 7 key recommendations. Now, obviously, we've only got one section we want to include, so we did look at really section 1 and potentially section 3 as well as kind of the key areas that would be of advantage for us. So an element that we focused on, we looked at this in terms of the tiers of vocabulary in maths, in other words, our keywords, because that is extremely important for our students when we talk about factors in maths. That's very different to in history when they talk about factors that have influenced World War I, for example. Obviously, the tiered vocabulary, just so we can see it a bit clearer. This is really what we've looked at, is to develop that tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, because sometimes it is that use of integer that is surprising, that can throw a student rather than if they just said whole number. So students being familiar with this vocabulary, understanding it, using it, has obviously a big advantage for us as a school. The other area we've also looked at is the etymology. Sometimes if we break down the origin of where that word has obviously come from, we have used the Freyer model, which you can kind of just see in the bottom, where at Key Stage 3, we give this to students. We emphasize which one of the key words or command words we want them to research. So we do put a big emphasis in Key Stage 3 on this, and that's why we wanted to make a big, obviously, emphasis on it for our learning journey. So the final section that we give our students is this. We identify the keywords. They then have obviously 3 sections. They might be very honest to be like, I've never heard of that word before. Some of them might feel actually they've heard of it, but they're not sure what it means, which is a very popular one for a lot of our students to tick. And I think that's probably the key one that we want to get right. And then obviously we have the final section, not just ticking that I know it. They then have to be able to explain that. Now, we give the keywords for the students at the start, so we have identified the full elements we want them to look at. To look at a fully completed learning journey, so this is to show you what we would provide to our students. I think that was kind of the easy element of our starting point for each topic. It's very quick to design, create, and as I've seen, especially in English, geography, science, where I've seen it used as well, it is quite easy for a subject specialist to create for their topic, their overview, whether it's over the course of a month, over a half term, etc. So the completed learning journey will look like this. So as we said, students will actually rag this. They're given this at the start of the unit work. We actually sometimes play some nice, relaxing classical music that's played in the background as the students attempt this before they start the topic. They'll read through the statements, they'll rag them based on what they think they can do, and then they have the mini assessment to complete before they receive any teacher's input. Now, as there is no input from the teacher, if a student has colored something in green, so like that first question which I showed previously, they should then be able to attempt this and to be able to get it correct. The mini assessment allows them to identify their starting point on the learning journey, but then most importantly, they refer to this as they go through the topic, and they're using it to track their progress over time. Now, for each topic in maths, we use a mixture of fluency, problem solving, and reasoning questions. So the same style of questions that are analysed at GCSE level. And we can see here in terms of where it increases, right down to the very end, which would be considered one of our more challenging style questions. We do place a big emphasis on reminding students if they cannot do the questions at the moment, that is perfectly fine. They just mightn't be able to do this yet. Now, if we look at it in terms of the why, this is where I'll go off on a slight tangent. And this is where I talk about, for example, how it's been developed even further by our staff and how it's become an aspect of our learning journey. So before I get to the literacy aspect again, I think one of the big success that we've seen in terms of the impact with students is how they use this. And obviously a lot of that I think is linked to the idea of their memory and attention. And it is extremely important to educate them on how to learn. Okay, in my previous experience, when I was in secondary school, I often tell students, I did not learn myself how to revise until I was in actual university. I went through the very simple system of I was reading over my notes, I might underline something, highlight something, and I could spend 30 minutes doing this. But if you asked me an hour later what I've just read, I couldn't tell you. And that was my idea of, well, this is revision. I'm brilliant. I've spent 30 minutes doing it. So a key bit for our students, and I think a key bit for anyone working in the educational sector, is to teach students about the memory. Okay, it is about how using their memory consistently shapes it. So when we think about something more, then obviously the more likely we are to strengthen our retention of that, because learning is the change in our long-term memory. And it's there, that famous quote, memory is the residue of thought. The more we think about something, it strengthens our memory of it. We ask students a very important question. How do they judge they know something? Okay, and in most cases, they might get answers like, I feel confident about it, I just know it, I can remember the information the next day, or the most important, I can remember the information months later. That is the challenge with a 2-year Key Stage 4. What we start in year 10, if we finish fully, we expect them to be able to remember that in year 11. So we've shaped our curriculum to be able to help them with that, but we're also making it clear to students ways that they can help themselves. And I think the key bit here is to look at the idea about what is memory. And if we look a bit about the research on memory and learning, okay, it's really how if we revisit something, it really strengthens our application. And the learning journey has really justified the impact of students going back to revisit topics they've learned and what they remember. I think most people are familiar with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, but it is important to show students you've learned something. If you then leave it and continue moving on with the next topic and the next topic, you're more likely to have forgot what you were extremely strong at the time, a few weeks later, a few months later, and even the following year. So teaching them in terms of what is the memory, how we obviously have our short-term memory, how some of that, and it is normal to actually forget it, and obviously what we need to be able to store that in our long-term memory, the rehearsal aspect, going back to revisit it, the retrieval practice, which is where one of the aspects we didn't expect students to do, but what they wanted, and I'll talk about that later, how they wanted further blank copies to quiz themselves. So that has had a huge impact. If we look at this in terms of the memory side of it, what we're doing in the classroom, and I will look at this in more detail, and the stages, I think it is extremely important that we have a student's attention. Anytime we acknowledge new information, it is being transferred into our working memory. Now, our working memory is finite. We can only absorb a limited amount of this before we will tend to forget it, or we are obviously where we want the learning to take place, where we have this process to our long-term memory. Now, this is effectively unlimited. Students can retrieve this back into their working memory when needed. And the more they try and do that, the more they remember it, that will then strengthen it in the long-term memory, but also means that they're going back revisiting it. It's not a case of, well, I've saved it there, I can access it whenever I want. Information in a long-term memory is organized into schema, and a key link there is obviously the prior knowledge, which is an important step of what we use in our learning journey. We can then see obviously anything that is not connected to a schema or not stored successfully, it will be forgotten, and forgetting is natural. We tell that to students why it is important. If we may remember something a month later, are we going to do it a year later if we don't revisit it? Okay, and there is something to be careful with. I think when we introduce a topic, we do address misconceptions. Although students will attempt these, we don't want them to actually store anything that we feel is incorrect. And especially the misconceptions there are sometimes the hardest to overwrite. That's where they have to be relearned. Where we've really seen, as we've said, the success with our students and a huge impact on their retention is how they have used the learning journey, and that links massively with the retrieval practice. Okay, because the more fluent students are retrieving this information from their working memory, then obviously the more likely they are to store this. Now, we cannot see the schema of what's going on. In other words, learning is hidden for our students. So that's where in teaching we need to be responsive and highly interactive to be able to gain as much feedback as possible, but also to gauge how the learning is going in our classroom. Obviously, in the next slide, I'm going to look at how we've helped our students avoid the pitfalls or the myth of obviously revision techniques. So what we've seen before is the illusion of competence. Now, this is something I think I've found myself and I've experienced when I was doing my revision. I was confident going into the exam, but it was only when the paper was in front of me that whenever a topic or a question came up, that's when I realized I didn't actually know this. So that illusion of competence might mean that students are spending the time revising and are showing the effort, but they're not getting the results, the increase in their attainment. So examples I sometimes give to the students is, if I ask you to name all the Premier League football teams, well, can you do it? The students who are confident be like, yes, of course I can. They'll only find out if they actually sit down to write out the 20 current Premier League football teams. And most of them might know the answer, but some of them might realize, well, I've got as far as 17, 18. I've actually forgotten a few here. Might have been very confident before I asked them, same as if it was whether to name certain fruit and vegetables, teachers in the school, or for examples for yourself, if I asked you to name the 7 dwarfs or Santa's reindeers. Sometimes it will take a quiz or a mini assessment to truly know what we remember. And the key emphasis we give to the students, it is best we find out this before the exam rather than in the exam, because that's going to have the impact on their results. Further research into terms of the memory and obviously the learning styles, it really shows that students are still using ineffective strategies, the same as I used in the 90s and 2000s. I'm not using strategies that are going to help me. For example, 11% using retrieval practice, 16% using the idea of actually testing themselves. Okay, now there is potentially a reason why we have students who, some cases, are not aware of these, but there is the examples of students who recognize effective strategies but do not use them because they're hard, and learning takes time. And sometimes it is much easier to read our notes and highlight and be confident then that we do know it, but then, as we said in the assessment, find out that that's an issue. So I'm just going to give a few seconds here. If you look at these 10 learning strategies, I just want you and yourself to kind of go through them, think, how would you rank them? High, moderate, and low in terms of their learning impact and success, because I think some of the key elements that came out of this, I suppose, is not only the, will it produce the desired outcome for our students, but it's also the fact that what our students say are considered to be high is actually proven through research not to be. So I'll just give 30 seconds for people to read through, rank them, see what they think. Now, the research in this obviously looked at the 10 of these, and it looked at the efficacy in terms of, obviously, the ability to produce the desired or intended result. And now, hopefully, some of you would have felt similar for some of these, what was moderate, what was low, what was high. But the key one that we kind of really focused on in that element, and what we kind of said, well, we can now see the impact in terms of the learning journey, was that practice testing. So going back to that element of the statements being backed up by the questions, when students wanted the blank copy of that, they wanted that 2-3 weeks into the topic, so that they had the one and they had obviously the correct answers in their books. They could see what they were able to do at the start. They then obviously would have seen the correct solutions at the end of that lesson. We then would have started the process of teaching, but then they wanted blank copies to be able to test themselves again. So when we did start an introduction about the memory and how it works, they realized the best way to revise for maths is to do maths, which means test yourself. You could do this at the start, or they couldn't do it. They then have learned it. Can they do it 2 to 3 weeks later? Can they do it the night before the exam? Because all the questions we've used in that quiz are exam style questions. So there will be something similar that could be used. And it's really highlighting to them where there is a mistake. And like I said, number 8 is the key one. Further feedback, I think, from this study that was interesting was students. Okay, 83% of students listed rereading notes or using their textbook as a strategy. Okay, nearly 55% ranked this as the #1 strategy. It has probably the least impact in terms of retaining knowledge. But when we talk about there, the 9 section, the practice, the recall, the self-testing, okay, just over 10% listed it as a strategy, and just 1% were using it as their #1 strategy. So to emphasize this to students, how what we're giving them at the start can be used for our first lesson, can inform future planning for the teachers, but also will highlight to the students, well, this is where we are, this is where it's going to go. Looking at that bigger picture, I think, is extremely important. So the retrieval practice being the key element of it, and this is how we got them to use the learning journey. It's making students aware of the learning strategy and why we do it. Now, in the next slide, I'm finally going to go back to the final piece of the learning journey. So that was just the last section. So you can see here, we've obviously provided the students with the keywords, and this is what they fill in. Now, there is a key bit of research again. So I talked about the EEF report into improving literacy across a secondary school, but we've seen it in numerous reports. Okay, if we want the students to be able to access our GCSE paper to get the top grades, then we need them to have the subject specific language. Now in maths, they're never having to write a big essay. But like I said, in terms of conditional knowledge, it's extremely important they know how to start a question, because there won't be a teacher in the classroom to say, this is what you need to do, go do it. And sometimes it's that little nudge in the classroom which will help them, but developing the literacy skills for them to be able to read through, and especially for our students, in which in many cases, English is their second language. I mean, I see it myself currently learning Spanish. I would not like to be doing an exam in this case. To show you examples of how students have used it and what it looks like in their exercise books, I'll just show you kind of probably my favorite example. So this shows what the student was given at the start. As you can see in the kind of pupil version on the top left, they've ragged it, what they were fairly confident in terms of they colored it in green. You can use obviously the amber color and then obviously the red to be like, I don't actually know this. And a key emphasis here is that we show students it's fine if you don't know this. This is the starting point. You don't know it yet. And that's something we obviously re-emphasize to them. We can then see the literacy section, which she's stuck in below that. And I'm going to just make this a bit bigger when it comes to the question. So this was an example we've used with percentages. Now, one of my most favorite aspects of this, and again, it was something that we've seen how students have used it. It wasn't necessarily what we directed them in terms of how to use it or what they did, but they started adding what we call our green pen. So the green pen technique is where they might find where they write little notes to themselves. This is how you do it. Now, in the maths lesson, I might encourage the students to write it in English or in Spanish, because it's not something for me to be aware of. It's for them to be able to, when they're revising, have a little pocket summary in their own words. This is what you need to do. Now, this student was able to go back, revisit this topic, add little green pen notes, and I particularly like the one here at the bottom. I can now do this, and she's explained the steps of what she needs to do. Originally, that would have been one of the things she colored in red, looked at the exam question, and even if very close in the question, if you can see down on the bottom right about Sophie, she's written, I cannot do this. So at the very start, she wasn't able to. She's then revisited it as we go through the topic. She's got a blank one of this before the exam to test herself again once we finished it, and she can highlight and see visible progress. Now, as I mentioned a bit later, I think that's one of the key elements. Increased effort doesn't always lead to increased attainment. And I think that goes back to the idea of the learning myths. So in other words, students putting a lot of time and effort in, but not with a strategy that's really helping them. What we have seen is actually students seeing visible progress, seeing where they started to where they're going. That's had probably the biggest impact in terms of increasing effort. So it's that increased attainment, that increased effort has led to more increased effort, and not the other way around. Showing just some other examples of how students have it. At the start, you can see I quite like this one in terms of they're describing it as good, bad, or medium. And in some cases, they've colored something in between. They've updated it, which I really enjoyed seeing as well, where they were, I think we see one update of still so-so, and now they've colored it into green, or now great, as some of the comments they've added. So it's brilliant for them to take ownership on this, that it's not just me standing in a classroom introducing the topic and seeing how they get on. And we can see this with numerous examples of where the students are doing, obviously attempting the working out, and then obviously going back to those key words. So if they're confident they know those key words before the start of a topic, but they're also confident they know it at the end, and then they're able to fill in those. So the kind of quick summary of how it's been implemented can kind of vary in terms of the subjects or how you may want to implement it in your case. So as I said, this is something that I'm showing examples that are very much maths based, but I also see it myself in terms of learning a language. I also see it in the terms of, I think it would help me in terms of other subjects if I was to learn them, where it can help students. So I'll just give you a few seconds to kind of read through. This is kind of the desired example of what we started with. Now we did slightly change it to make it work for us. And as we've seen, we've learned along the way by seeing how students have used it as well. Now, as with everything, it is great to obviously see what we've kind of been able to start with this, get feedback when we implemented it from students, from staff, but we have also then looked at the impact. And obviously, with the first year of doing this, we did trial it in year 9 with just 2 groups. Now, due to the setup in our school and due to basically the protocols due to COVID, we didn't have sets in year 9. So we had mixed ability. We had obviously 2 forms that we tried it with. Now, when I say we tried it with 2 forms, one of them didn't, and the other group did have the learning journey. And what we were able to see after the first assessment, which was the learning journey was not used, we calculated the class average. Now we can see that obviously class A, minimal difference between them. So that was one of the main reasons we picked these 2 groups. It did seem to be the class average was quite similar. Now, as a mathematician, I'm delighted to see in terms of the second assessment and the third assessment that we do see that improvement. And in particular in the third assessment, in what was quite a challenging exam, class B and their class average has performed one of the highest in that year. So it did show clear success for our students in that sense. But although I'm delighted with what it shows, we do have to look at, okay, well, there is an impact, but there is the other side of it. First of all, it could be the consistency with approach. So we do have form groups, they are different ability. That was kind of our control study. We did try and pick 2 classes that had very similar results in terms of the class average for their first result. We also, because we picked those 2 groups based on that, we did have different teachers teaching it. So we would have to acknowledge, was there an element in that? Okay, did one teacher also have a big aspect in terms of turning around and improving the results with one group? Looking at the prior knowledge, okay, based on those 2 assessments they did, was there the prior knowledge of, were they more familiar with that from previous years of a topic, one class more than the other? But I think one of the big aspects we had was developing independent learners. And that's a huge positive that we could see in that one group. So when we showed that examples of how they're using it, but also they've acknowledged in that idea of memory, how to learn, and using that basically testing technique. I think the feedback from students and probably the most enjoyable aspect was speaking to students afterwards. And I will just show you some of the quotes that we've had from our students. So I think this one does link to one of the key points I've talked about, visible progress. And it is, sometimes we talk about, well, and it links back to the mindset, being naturally gifted at maths. There's no such thing. And sometimes I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have in secondary school, of where that idea of, well, I've never any good at maths. My parents were never any good at maths. Okay, with increased effort, they have seen the results. Now that increased effort has come in terms of a way of getting them not to work harder, but what we've taught our students is to work smarter. So I think that key quote here is probably the one I enjoyed the most. We've had quotes from students who said during the topic, they've used it to revise, they've kept a few blank sheets, as I said, they wanted then to quiz themselves with. So it's had that success. It wasn't one of the ones we started out with that idea, but it's been a great metacognition learning journey for us as the department to be like, well, let's look more into the research. This has probably had a big impact on their results. For our students, I think some of the other quotes that they've had, seeing what we're going to do in the next few weeks, helped me see how things linked. Now that goes into a big part in terms of in a secondary school and the work that people have done on curriculums and that idea, for example, of the big picture. So in other words, getting the buy-in from students can sometimes be, well, why are we doing this? Where does this link in the grand scheme of things? So that we're not always saying, well, you're doing it because I said so. I think it's really important that we get the buy-in from students in that side of things. I enjoyed attempting the questions at the start with no pressure to be correct. So that's why the kind of classical music is there playing in the background. We didn't want it to mimic an exam setting. We also wanted to make it very clear, guys, if you color in everything red because you're not fully sure of it, that is fine. The point of this is over the next few weeks, this is where we are going to take you on the journey and teach you this. And I think that was a key element of that. They don't see it as, well, this is an assessment. If you can't do it, or if you're coloring in red, we're going to go show your parents. And it's that element of, okay, see what I can do, and then go back to revisit it. And the final quote I really enjoyed, I felt proud at seeing my improvement on the learning journey and in my test. So students were well aware to see, well, actually in the first test result without this, and then following in the next two that we've done over those two terms, where they see a big improvement in their results. So that is always extremely important. It does kind of go back to the idea, and it's probably something that Matthew Syed has written an incredible book about, the cognitive diversity, okay, and how our students, it's not necessarily learning styles, but it's how we think differently, how we view things differently. And I think that's obviously interesting for the learning journey for our students, how they've used this, how we as the department have obviously implemented it, adapted it and changed it. But I think the biggest success for us was changing our approach from providing a checklist of topics to be covered, but to involving students in this creative process. It's had a huge impact on both attainment and student engagement. Okay, even our most disengaged student did quite enjoy going back and looking at, I couldn't do this, but now look, I can, and seeing visible progress. By monitoring their learning goals over time and through having progress highlighted, students did become more motivated. They were able to evaluate both their achievements and their own understanding. Feedback from students, as we've seen, has not only highlighted the benefits of seeing visible progress, but also supported them to be more confident in preparation for any assessments they have completed during the year, leading to an improvement in their attainment, but also into their mental well-being. It is something they've specifically asked, could it be possible to use in other subjects? So I think that has been obviously a key bit of the feedback from them. But thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and have spotted ways that this could obviously improve your practice, or elements of how you can use this and adapt it and change it to make it work for your students. I'll now obviously just switch back so that we can go to any questions there might be. I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Kieran. I've put some questions in the Q&A myself. Firstly, those results are very impressive. Well done. And I think you just answered that question. Have there been any additional benefits to using these approaches that weren't originally planned? And you did mention it wasn't just attainment, but it was also mental well-being and confidence as a whole. What about using this in a different kind of discipline? That was another question that I mentioned earlier. Has this been trialed across other subject disciplines?
Well, that's what we're kind of currently looking at the moment,
Mhm.
is the idea of how we can use it in science, because it's probably the most obvious link in terms of the math side of it. But then I also kind of, and what we're working on with the teaching and learning leader for English, is how can we implement this in English? And in English, there is actually a big aspect of this, which is useful for maths. Throughout the year, we'll obviously create an awful lot of these learning journeys, because coordinate geometry is obviously a big topic, but could be covered in 3 to 4 weeks. So that means we'd have a learning journey like that. In English, it might be that they have one over a half term, or in some cases, they might be doing a novel over a term. So they've looked at implementing it this year. And again, I think it's breaking down. It's helped some of our subject leaders look at it in terms of, why are we doing something in the curriculum? So when they kind of evaluated the starting point to where they're going to go at the finish, that helped them look at their curriculum. But I think in English, that was a key aspect, and they're trialing it with one of the novels they do in year 9. They give students kind of obviously the key word side of it, and they've kind of adapted it to make it work. It wasn't a case of, this is how we've done it in maths, this is the template. I'll be honest, the English have made it look a bit nicer as well for the English department in terms of how the template looks, but they've made it work for their subject. And that's now at the end of the year, it'll be interesting to see the feedback from students, how they've used it. I think in science, it kind of transitions really well. And in English, the feedback at the moment is students like it. They see the advantages of it because we're using it actually with year 10s in English. So some of the students are now familiar with the learning journey because obviously they've used it in maths. So they like the fact that it's appearing in other subjects as well.
Right. Do we have a question from Catherine? I believe Catherine briefly had her hand up. No? Kieran, how much lesson time is given to the learning journey in comparison to classes without one?
So the very first lesson, we'd obviously use this and we'd give the whole lesson to it because we don't want to rush it. Obviously, it involves the slightly boring admin side, which I find boring, but the students tend to enjoy cutting them out, sticking them in the book. And then obviously we give the whole lesson for them to read through the statements, obviously the literacy side of it and the questions, because we don't flood it with loads of questions. So as you can see, I've tried to limit it to at most 2 slides with the questions put in there. We give them the full 50 minutes to attempt it. And then now where it's kind of been slightly done different, and this is where I acknowledge in terms of I know one group didn't do it and another group did, but in other classes where we rolled it out, one teacher would visibly go back after a week to touch base with the learning journey, and another one wouldn't go back until the very end. So either way, the first and last lesson were the definites with all the groups, but some staff would actually go back as well just to break it up in between and spend 10 minutes being like, well, go back here. Or sometimes as students are coming into the room after we've just covered one of those key skills, they'd use it as a starter on the board. And we'd use that in terms of a retrieval practice as students are coming in or do now task. In other words, whilst they're doing that, it allows them to obviously just start that whilst we're waiting for all the students to join.
Right. And what I found most surprising was when we were ranking the strategies. I think personally I have been revising the wrong way uh, throughout my whole education. I mean, have you taken on board some of these strategies yourself, like maybe for your masters or?
I think so. I'll use the same example with our students in terms of if I go into a group now and I've done this in assembly in terms of how to revise. So like our study skills session, I always go with the same example. I'll pick a student I know and I'll just tell them I'm going to ask you questions about a hobby of yours. Now, for a lot of them, and because it kind of links with the knowledge I would have, it might be a football related one. So in the school currently, we've a high proportion of Real Madrid or Atletico Madrid fans. And it is interesting where even if I put one of them on the spot, ask them a series of questions and then start going off on a tangent. So it might be one of their answers is about a player who's French. And then I might link it to something to do with a French player in a different league. But the key bit that students realize is actually, I do know this. And they've stored that information in their brain because they've made the links with this themselves because they have an interest in the topic. And I think that's always useful. I've done the same with Netflix shows, with books. So it highlights to all the students, you are storing this information. Why? It's not only because you enjoy it or you like it, it's because you've made links. It's because something stood out as strange. And I think there was a great example a student told me before about a show called Riverdale on Netflix, but she remembered obviously the name of the actor. She remembered that he was from New Zealand, and I was asking, it was interesting to be like, well, why did you remember he was from New Zealand? And she just said it was a Canadian-based show, and she just found it strange that someone from New Zealand was in the lead. So the link she had made, that's something that she found interesting. She stored that information in her long-term memory. It's of no benefit to her, but it just shows how we can do that. And I think that's a key bit of repeating those strategies and showing, well, this is actually what happened. You've made a link to this. You've probably revisited it when watching, being like, oh, he's from New Zealand, without even acknowledging it. So strengthening the memory there by constantly going back, revisiting, etc.
Okay, great. And tell me, have the effort levels of disengaged students increased as a result of the learning journey? Like, what behaviors have you noticed or what have you observed in the classroom?
I think that's probably one of the nice impacts we've seen as well. I mean, where students can use this as a guide, some of the feedback, and I've seen it in a previous school I worked in, part of my responsibilities was looking at raising boys' attainment. It was kind of a key aspect of my role.
Mm.
And in some cases, we had obviously issues where in some of the maths and science subjects, the results were good, which we've seen nationally in England. And we looked at then in our school previously, it was their English results that weren't as good. And it was a case of, well, in some cases, it wasn't due to the lack of effort. In some cases, we obviously looked at the feedback processes our students were receiving because, as they pointed out, I just don't know how to improve. And that kind of linked with in terms of I just don't know how to revise. In maths, they were doing the revision in terms of the way we know works. In maths, it's very simple for a 5-mark question to sit down and do it. Whereas it's harder to do that in English in terms of not necessarily to write an essay. So in some cases, it was showing them strategies of the Cornell method of note taking, which has an aspect of quizzing. There's another one, I think it's called the Leitner method of the flashcards, and where they put them each time they get it right, it goes one further back. And each time they get it obviously wrong, it goes to the front. So that's the first one they quiz. And that's kind of how to revise and obviously link that in. And that's kind of, I suppose, one of the key aspects of the learning journey. Students asking, can I have a blank copy of the questions? I like this for revision. We're providing them with the resources for our students who are normally disengaged with maths, those who feel I'm not very good at this and this job, I've never been any good at this. And sometimes that's a stigma that unfortunately kind of is built on in primary school or it's built on at home. It's one of these subjects where it's rare for a parent to be like, I was never any good at English, but they will say I was never any good at maths. And that's kind of a
Yes.
common statement people will say. So that it can be ingrained. Whereas now students were able to say, well, okay, we weren't very good at the start. We weren't able to do this. But now at the end, look at what we can do. And it might mean that they can do everything, but they can definitely see the progress. And that progress has helped them in terms of, okay, become more motivated in the subject, want to do well, and then how they've used the learning journey has given them the revision questions or strategies that they need. And then obviously seeing the improvement on the test has probably had the biggest impact. That improvement is led to obviously more engagement and more effort as a result.
Another question, when did you really start working on when did you implement the learning journey in your school? And do you communicate this with parents? Because one of the most important things is to talk about, or for students to realize their own progress. And have you shared this approach with parents? Do you have parent buy-in also?
It's one, to be honest, from last year. It's not something that we informed parents of what we were doing. It's obviously a strategy we used in the school. We implemented it. I started school last year in September, so obviously the first few weeks and obviously the first month or two, really until the half term, was kind of looking at what's in place in the maths department. There's, as usual, every time when you start a new school, I mean, you're walking around like a year 7 myself. I was wondering, where is this room? Trying to find it. So there was all these little things, but after the first half term, after we had that first assessment, it was then obviously the few weeks before that, showing the maths department, this is what we're going to be doing, how to use it, because I actually wasn't a teacher of year 9 myself. So it was up to the other members of the department to have the buy-in so that they could see the benefit of it. They were the ones who were rolling it out and pushing it, which is brilliant. And I think a lot of them really enjoyed it. And then obviously, as we've seen with the impact from the results, we didn't really inform parents about it, but this year it's kind of one of the aspects. We have like a parental handbook. So we've put it in as part of, well, this is the learning journey that they're doing in year 9. This is how it's used. This is a way to obviously have it. So we've kind of made parents more informed about it now. I mean, it doesn't affect the quality of teaching, as I said, in terms of students are still being taught the topic as that, well, with the teacher style. And then obviously this is just being used to supplement it in terms of highlighting the visible progress, but also giving them a resource that will help them be able to revise at home.
Great, great. I'm in the Q&A. I've just uploaded a link to the next MOOC on British Council to English Teaching English, which is about professional development, because this is our final session, and I've included the link there for participants. If there are no further questions, thank you very much, Kieran. That was very useful. That was very interesting.
No problem.
Thank you everyone for attending, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you all for attending. Enjoy their evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Bye everyone.
Bye.